Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on where you are, where you're coming from on this spinning blue marble floating through the vast expanse of space and time. Part four of our recovery series. Super excited to bring Omi Iwasaki into the conversation. Again, my name is Tristan Rice, performance specialist, education person, and man with many hats here at Exos. Based in Phoenix, Arizona. This has been a really great series for us to be able to explore concepts that is relatively new to us, functional state, right? Like in sort of understanding different categories of stress load, understanding ways that the body responds to that, and from different perspectives, from various perspectives, how do we attack stress? How do we attack internal load? And we had perspective from Dr. Chris Bertram, from more of a psychological perspective, dealing with some of that stress load. Shannon Earhart, last time on part three, with more specific nutrition strategies, and now Omi coming in now. Omi coming in now to give us more of a movement and mechanical sort of base lens. So I'm really excited about that. Omi, do you want to just give a quick sort of introduction of yourself, and then we can jump in and get going?
Yeah, my name's Omi. I've been with Exos since 2003. My formal education comes from physical education, athletic training background, as well as physical therapy. I also have worn multiple hats within this organization over the years, but started off in our elite facilities as a physical therapist. So that is my background.
And of course, folks who are watching and who've been paying attention to the membership model, the content that's been posted would know you well from some of the many video series that you did with Stefan on rotational power and all these other sorts of things. So, I think diving into this, I think the best thing to do initially, maybe to just have a bit of a recap to where we've been before, right? So let's revisit this idea of functional state, bring everybody back up to speed, make sure that we're all on the same page, speaking the same language, and then bridge into new territory, right? Like thinking about this concept of kinetic linking is something that I want to explore a bit today, Omi, because it's something that we've talked about for a really long time. Shoulders, torso, hips need to be able to work together, and we all, I think, qualitatively, we all understand that. I think the thing that's been lacking, at least for me, is a quantitative representation of what that actually looks like, right? Like, what does it mean for shoulders, torso, hips to work together, and what happens when they don't, right? Like we talk about energy leaks, these sorts of things, but it feels like there's opportunity to fill in some gaps, and so I'm really excited to get into that with you. And then finally, thinking about what we can do about it, right? Like when we then identify that there are errors or energy leaks or discord in the kinetic linking and the kinetic chain, like what can we do about it from a systematic standpoint, understanding the lens or through the lens of position, pattern, power. And so as we first get into this, we're going to revisit and bring everybody up to speed again on functional state. And functional state is an exciting new idea for us that stress, although stress could be, although our responses to stress from an internal perspective, right, the physiological response to stress seems to be organized all by the sympathetic nervous system, or rather the autonomic nervous system, right? That you have your fight, your flight, and your freeze branch, right, of the sympathetic, and then you have the rest and digest, being the yang to the yin of that, through the autonomic nervous system, right, of turn on and turn off. And so all of it, irrespective of the type of stress that we're under, it's sympathetic nervous system that ends up modulating the response to it. And so, is there a way for us to organize the type of stress that we're under? For example, if somebody is under a really heavy neural stress load, right? They do big, heavy, fast training sessions. Is that stress going to be felt, quote unquote, felt the same as, for example, doing like a big metabolic session, right? Like if you're going out and you go out on your bike and you decide to go for a bike ride and you fill up your water bottles and you decide to come back on Thursday, right? Like, is that stress going to be the same as, this big, heavy, fast training session? And so what we look at when we look at these different types of things are 4 different categories of stress load, right? And the idea is that these categories represent an external load, right? And we could have that external load just be an objective representation of what the training session is, right? That could be 3 sets of 2 at 93% 1 rep max, right? Like, and if you have a great history of strength training, right, and training in and around those zones, that external load is going to be internalized by you, right? Like, and that internalization of that external load is the stimulus that we respond to that helps pull us out of that dip into supercompensation. And so if you have, for example, a really great history of training in and around those zones, 3x2 at 93%, the internal load, the way that the stress, the load that applies to your system is going to be less than compared to me, for example, who, like, I don't recently have a whole lot of experience training in and around those zones. So that session, 3x2 at 93%, that would probably knock me out for a week. I'd be stuck on the couch, not able to do stuff, right? Like trying to manage soreness and these sorts of things, right? And so that that external load, 3x2 at 93%, gets internalized based on our current level of fitness or our performance capacity in and around that zone. And then we think about ways to sort of catapult back out, pull ourselves out of that dip through general adaptation syndrome into and towards supercompensation. And so when we think about different types of stress loads, we think first about a neural type of stress load with training sessions with a heavy load or high speed, right? Example we gave just now, of course, 3x2 at 93%, and targeting strategies towards that. Right. So we think about, could you get into a cold tub? Is that going to be effective at stimulating a response through the nervous system? Some static stretching to sort of decrease sympathetic tone. Shannon gave phenomenal strategies about nutrition strategies to manage inflammation. And thinking, of course, about sleep as the catch-all and the low-hanging fruit of recovery, right? Having such great applicability across a broad range of stress loads. Right. And in addition to neural, we understand there's also a mechanical stress, right? And this would be stress that's applied to soft tissues, right? This could be heavy training sessions with slightly higher volume. So you think like a 5x5 or a 6x6 on like 2 or 2.5 minutes of rest, where you're going to accumulate a bit of work over time. Sessions generally that qualify as mechanical stress loads are going to be the sessions that make you feel sore the next day, right? Like it could be a heavy lift. Or it could be, that you ran up a mountain and then you decided to run back down as well, right? And all that eccentric loading controlling your body weight as you descend down the backside of that mountain, that could also, I think, certainly qualify as a mechanical stress load. And so here we think about strategies to manage in terms of things like soft tissue strategies, compression boots, static or potentially even dynamic flexibility routines, nutrition to support muscle protein synthesis, thinking about like a carb to protein ratio immediately afterwards and what your sources of protein are. And then, of course, sleep here as well. And so we think about neural and mechanical sessions, and we understand that a neural-based session, if we could just sort of take a moment to expand a little bit, a neural-based session is not going to be exclusively neurally driven, right? If you're a 3x2 at 93%, like your nervous system is going to take the brunt of that load because, it's got to organize all of the hands pulling on the oars in the same direction and at the same time, right? Like you've got to have high levels of but more so intramuscular coordination, right? That's a big stimulus on the nervous system to be able to organize that action, that deep into motor unit pools. But of course, the soft tissue's got to do the work, right? The soft tissue is the one that's actually pulling the oars. Right. And so we understand that we can classify sessions as neural or mechanical, but understand that there's going to be a crossover, right? That a neural session is going to have also a significant mechanical stimulus as well. And then a mechanical session is also going to have a neural stimulus, but that a mechanical session, beyond just being primarily mechanical with a bit of neural, is also going to have a bit of a metabolic stimulus as well, right? The time, withstanding the duration of the time that it takes to do the work, right? And have energy available and ready to be supplied there. And so metabolic sessions are more, cardiovascularly challenging sessions, right? To use some like a common sort of term. Again, you think about, you get on your bike and you just had to go for a bike ride and you come back on Thursday, right? Like, or you go for a 6-hour elliptical ride, or you go and you stand up paddleboard between islands, right? Like you do these sort of metabolically stimulating things, which are challenging to the soft tissue, no doubt, which are imposing a bit of a demand on the neural, but primarily is the demand is on the ability to supply energy at the rate that is necessary to complete the task that you're trying to do, right? Like, so we have training sessions with higher volumes or longer durations, right? Staying in the gym example here might be your 3x12, right? Like maybe it's a foundational session. Maybe it's a metabolic hypertrophy type session. If you have metabolic conditioning sessions, right? Metabolic conditioning sessions are definitely going to fit, I think, in here, doing strength-based movements, but at metabolic type speeds and loads. And so here we think about targeting with compression boots, right? Like having, or not necessarily boots, but having compression, right? Concentrically focused, non-weight bearing yellow zone ESD sessions, right? Because you can stimulate blood flow to the area. You can stimulate lymphatic drainage of like the dead bad stuff out of the tissue. And being concentrically focused, we know that we're not going to stimulate the same level of mechanical stress that we would if we also included the eccentric phase. And here we think about nutrition to manage inflammation. Shannon gave some great tips and tricks just here, and focusing here on sleep, right? And so we have these 4 different categories of stress loads, of neuromechanical, metabolic, and psychological. And we talked to Chris before, and psychological piece as well. I got ahead of myself. I was excited. Right? Like where the psychological stress is the stress of like this inter and intrapersonal, right? Like how do I deal with the people around me, with the environment, the social environment around me, and then how do I deal with myself, right? And thinking about the stress and the load that places on you. Because I'm sure that we've all had a situation where we go in to do a training session or we go to do something and you sort of just get in your own head and you psych yourself out in a session that maybe you've repeated before in the past. Because you get yourself mentally so spun up, you're not able to perform at the same level, right? And so we understand, of course, that there's going to be broad sort of applicability of these things. For example, a neural is going to have a high mechanical stimulus as well. A mechanical is going to have a neural and a metabolic, right? And that all of these are going to be flavored with the spice of psychological stress load, right? And so what we have to consider is, when we have stress loads of one type or another, how do we then periodize and program our recovery modalities to the same extent that we periodize and recovery our training modalities, right? I think that that's a really critical concept and an area that we're really moving into, and it's something that's really exciting. And so in part 2 of this, we spoke with Chris about what are some psychological strategies that we can do, and he talked about your mindset, right? Like, are you willing to accept the challenge? Do you believe that your ability in any given thing is not fixed, right? Is not immutable, but rather is something that you can change with focus and with persistence and with effort, right? Like, so what's your mindset? Are you a growth or a fixed-minded person? You think about your internal awareness of your understanding of your body in space and time, right? Like your body in terms of like what's happening below the neck, but also what's happening above the neck. What is your current sort of status? And then thinking about ways through the ANS regulation, going and spinning around the wheel just a bit more quickly, to upregulate or downregulate as necessary, right? Chris talked a lot about aligning your biological rhythm, your internal rhythm, to the light dark cycle of the 24-hour day and night period, right? And so simple strategies to manage stress load, environmental or maybe even psychological stress loads of simple things like getting 2 to 10 minutes of blue light and outdoor sunshine on your skin and specifically into your eyes within an hour of waking up. One thing that Chris recommended that's been really helpful for me is delaying caffeine intake by 45 to 60 minutes after you wake up, to give your body time to naturally sort of pull out of that sleep stage and up into that sort of wakeful phase, right? And so these sort of things that we can do to align our biological rhythm. And Chris also talked about, and this is something that I really enjoyed, this idea of stress inoculation, that that you can lean into and choose to expose yourself to stressful situations on the idea that then practices and to a certain extent even rehearses the way that you respond to stress from a psychological perspective as it's applied in real time. And he highlighted a research study that I thought was really interesting, where there were a group of mice that they put like an owl on top of the cage, right? Like obviously a stressor, right? A predator to a prey species. And some mice, for some reason, right? They don't know why, but some mice would freeze, right? They would play dead. Some mice would run and hide. right? And then some mice actually leaned into it, right? They stood up, they sort of puffed their chest, they sort of said, bring it on, right? And those mice that accepted the challenge, right? That not flight, not freeze, but those mice that decided to fight, they got not only, the same sort of sympathetic nervous system activation, but they also got a significant release of dopamine. And so what Chris said, which is of course the feel-good hormone. And so what Chris said that I thought was really interesting is that when we choose to lean into stressful or even to a certain extent frightening situations, when we do that voluntarily, you not only have the opportunity to practice the way that you respond to those stresses, but you also get a reward, right? And that it feels good, right? Like once it's done, it feels good to have done that. And so he said that was really powerful. And these then represent strategies to be able to regulate your autonomic nervous system, right? That then is opportunity in advance of a stress being applied to then deal with a stress in the moment when it is applied, because you have opportunity to sort of make a better decision about how you respond. And so from a psychological perspective, from an above the neck sort of perspective, Chris talked about these sort of strategies. And then last time with Shannon gave some really great tips and tricks around nutrition, right? And thinking about things that we can do to manage inflammation generally. And she talked a lot about, the inflammatory process, and we have pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory, different types of lipids, and the role of omega-6 and omega-3, lipid mediator class switching, all types of fancy great stuff. It was phenomenal. But some things that she said specifically were manage your gut, right? Like if you put your gut in a good position, your body's going to be in a good position. A significant amount of neurotransmitter for your nervous system is generated in your gut, right? So if your gut's happy, you're going to be happy. She talked about prioritizing omega-3 fatty acids, ideally looking at a ratio of 1-to-1 of an omega-6 to an omega-3, right? And she said in a typical American diet, that can actually be 25-to-1, right? Have 25 times omega-6 than the omega-3 that we're getting. And so she said, looking at things like prioritizing fatty fish like salmon and cod, looking at flax seeds and walnuts and these sorts of things can really be helpful at boosting your omega-3 while also at the same time limiting omega-6. And the recommendation that she gave to me was to quit hydrating with canola oil. that we try to stay away from vegetable oils and these other sorts of things that are really high in omega-6 generally. She talked about anti-inflammatory foods, right? Foods that are a usual suspects, right? Stuff that you would expect to be recommendations that you expect a dietitian to be making. Thinking about dark leafy greens, thinking about cherries, thinking about beets, thinking about these other sorts of things that are going to help your body manage the inflammatory process. And then once we've done those things, right, not necessarily in a 1, 2, 3 order, but all of those blocks, if we can lock those things in, then she said, let's look at supplementation. And simple guidelines that she gave there was looking at a fish oil with a gram of EPA DHA, as representing omega-3 fish oil supplement. And another recommendation that she gave to support your gut health was having 5 milligrams of glutamine per day. And so those were some good things. Between Chris and Shannon, what I really like about that stuff is that stuff sort of feels like table stakes, right? That stuff sort of feels like like the stuff that's on the margins, and it's easy for us to forget about that stuff. Honestly, it's easy. It's easy for us to forget the way that stress accumulates into the body, right? And think about so thinking about ways that we can manage psychological stress. Thinking about nutrition strategies that we can have to support the inflammatory process, going from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory, right? Like those sorts of things really set the stage for recovery to happen. But Omi, now that we sort of brought everybody up to speed on that, I'm curious to know, like from your perspective, thinking about a lens more on movement quality, something like this, kinetic linking, no doubt. Where does like stress come from, right? Like what is stress? We gave, neuromechanical, metabolic, psychological, but when we have like, if we get into, this idea of kinetic linking and energy leaks and compensation, I think that's a really interesting opportunity to sort of round out the conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I believe, we've been talking about kinetic linking as a organization for 20 plus years, but I think we've really over the last 3 or 4 years really just started to peel it back and have a much easier way to discuss kinetic linking and also for us to discover where these issues are happening. And like you said, the psychological nutritional pieces are table stakes and they are the game changers. They are the on the margin. They are the 10%, the 20% that's on the outside. But, if we don't move well, all of those things in the world aren't going to really help us move better. So we have to look at kind of why are areas being overloaded in the first place. So most musculoskeletal injuries, and a lot of our participants typically ask us about musculoskeletal injuries or pain. And what we have to look at is why is that area being overloaded in the first place? They're already giving us a signal that something is wrong. And we typically like to blame, that one body part. So look at, for example, knee pain, is it always the knee's fault? We like to say, oh, I have a bad knee. Oh, my patellar doesn't track correctly, or, oh, whatever the case is, we tend to place blame on that body part that might be painful or presenting itself with pain or something like that. So,
well, and you see kids who are playing soccer, it getting like a lateral release for the patella, right? Because it's the knee's fault. The knee hurts. It must be the knee's fault, right?
It must be the knee's fault. Absolutely. And I think this is what traditionally, traditional medicine, traditional orthopedics, and even rehab has really focused over the years on is just that single body part focus. And again, I think, you may look at training above and below generally as a shotgun approach of general strength as well. But we have to look at kind of the mechanical load sharing that needs to happen, as well as the neuromuscular control of that load sharing that needs to happen, the sequencing, the patterning. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. So just as simple as we can make it, we basically have two major patterns that our body has to be able to do in coordination, from a kinetic linking standpoint. You can call it load sharing of the shoulder, torso, hips. So we've talked about our pillar as an organization of our shoulder, torso, hips. That is our core. That is our engine. That is what transfers force. That is what produces force. That is what transfers from the lower to the upper quarter, as well as the upper to the lower quarter, as well as from the right to the left side. And as simple as we can make it, we have an absorption capability. Can you absorb force down across midline with the shoulder going into an extension or behind your back position, as well as your T-spine rotating to that same side? And then that same side hip would be in flexion and into rotation. So if you think of absorption, if you take a step forward and you need to absorb that force to the ground, you need to get your center of gravity over that base of support. And if you just think of pure locomotion activity like gait, you look at the arm swing is happening opposite what the leg is doing. The leg is coming forward, your arm is going back. It's a split pelvis and a split thorax position happening in opposition.
So you have this situation. I just want to make sure that I'm following. You have the situation where if I'm walking, right, and I step with my right foot. So this is saying that when I absorb force on my right foot, my hip is going to eccentrically go through a bit of flexion with a little bit of relative internal rotation.
Right.
My thoracic spine is going to rotate to the right as I accept my body weight over that side, and my right arm is going to, or my elbow is going to drive backwards.
Yeah.
Right? Is that what you're saying? That
Simply
you sort
put,
of make that shape in order, from the ground up, to be able to control your body weight over the ground.
Simply put, that's what needs to happen. And again, there are kind of relative norms for each of those areas that need to happen. And when that doesn't happen, your body is an unbelievable compensator and a cheater. So it'll make sure you don't fall over and fall on your face, because no one likes to fall on their face. So it'll figure out a path of least resistance of making up for that somewhere. The knee has some inherent rotation, but it's not typically, it's more of a hinge joint than a rotational joint. The knee could take that stress. The ankle could take that stress. The lower back could take that stress. I mean, it could manifest in multiple areas. But if these three areas don't work in harmony together, we're going to have problems. So conversely now... go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that really is sort of the basis of our understanding kinetic linking, for the last dozen years, 15 years, 20 years.
100%.
that these things have to work together. And so it seems like we're just sort of filling in the gaps of shoulder has to do, torso has to do, hip has to do on one side versus the other. So what's happening on the other side?
Right. So then on the other side, now you just gave the example of the right side of the body. So once we absorb that force, now we have to turn and produce force in the opposite direction to propel us forward.
Sure.
So now if it's the right leg that we're talking about here, we absorb force down across midline to the right. Now we need to produce force to step toward the left. So the arm swing on the opposite side of the body will be coming forward.
Sure.
Arm is coming forward. Your T-spine is rotating away toward that left side. And that right hip is now going into extension and relative external rotation because of the rotation away. Again, to produce
pushing the ground away.
Pushing the ground away, and you're moving to your left.
So we have this absorption.
Yes.
Right. I step on my right foot. Right. I control my body weight over my center of mass, over my base of support. And that seems like it's happening eccentrically from the ground up. And then we produce force concentrically from the top down.
Yes.
Through the opposite pattern.
Right.
Right. Like, and that's all happening on the one side of the body, on the right side of the body, in that example of stepping onto the right foot.
Right. The reference limb is the right side, and that adds a little more complication because we will look at right and left sides separately, and again that eccentric and concentric action separately, which I guess gets a little more complex. But simply put, just think of the two phases. You have to absorb and you have to propulse. Yeah. That's as simple as we can make it. You have to flex and you have to extend. You have a triple flexion. Just look at the lower quarter because we're talking about the knee. We have a triple flexion mechanic that happens. And then we have a triple extension mechanic that happens. And again, there's some coordination that has to happen with the upper quarter, the shoulder, and the T-spine with those two kind of actions.
Yeah. In order to be able to direct it. That's really interesting. Can we see, have you got some images that we can see? Right.
Yeah,
to look at it?
Let's keep going here. So here's a guy going down the turf here with looking fast in cheetah print, because cheetah print always makes you look fast.
Cheetahs are fast, man. My 4-year-old, she's a cheetah. She runs around the house. She's so fast. She's a cheetah. And this is his right foot. He's catching himself on his right foot here, isn't it?
This is the right foot. This is your example that you just said. Again, this is more of a sport context, but he's now absorbed force on his right side, and he's looking to move to the next phase, which is going to be pushing off that right side. But as that right side is absorbing, his center of gravity is now over his base of support. His center of gravity is rib cage. His T-spine is pointing toward that lead knee. So you have the T-spine rotating to that same side. That hip is now in a flex position. You see it's in a flex position and relative internal rotation because the torso is rotating toward that side, and that shoulder is behind his center of gravity, behind his base of support in an extended
driving
position.
Backwards.
Right.
Yeah.
He's throwing his arm backwards. So that's what needs to happen for this loading phase.
And you can imagine then what he's going to do after that, right? Like just a couple of frames after that, he's just going to do everything there, but in the opposite.
And we talk about the importance. Yeah, we talk about the importance of the glutes. I think people talk about the glutes all the time, but glute is a hip extender and an external rotator. So in order to load it properly, you have to flex and internally rotate.
You have to do the opposite.
Right.
Right. To put it in a position to be able to work optimally.
Optimally, yeah. So let's look at another example.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. So here's
No. I was just going to say, is there a non-linear example?
Yeah, non-linear example. And again, even though it is linear, it is rotational. All linear movement is rotational in nature.
Sure.
I think we tend to make it anti-rotation because we think rotation is bad. Rotation is life.
Yep.
So someone running down the field is a rotational sport. We only think of rotational sports typically with our swinging sports, or throwing sports, kicking sports, rotational like implement type bat, club, racket type sports. But again, it is a little bit easier to see in those type of sports. So here's a perpendicular med ball throw with Nicole here, and we're just referencing the rear leg. As she puts
left side here.
Yeah, the left side of the body, our right side, her left hip.
Yeah.
But as she puts that med ball into her pocket down across midline, what action is happening here? It's the same action as if she were to step forward on her left leg. She has to load that rear leg properly, which is rotating. You see her T-spine rotating. So you see that her sternum is now pointing toward her rear knee, center of gravity over base of support. It's no longer vertical because we're in a diagonal orientation because it's a rotational sport.
Yeah.
That hip is in a flexed position, in a relative internal rotated position. And then again, you see that arm has to drop back. Shoulder blades are retracted or adducted. The anterior shoulder girdle is now put on stretch. That arm is back. So now she's loaded properly.
And even though, you know, this is a more classically rotational exercise compared to, you know, sprinting, which is more classically a linear exercise, right? Like the whole idea of, you know, all motion being multiplanar is, I think we could have probably a 6-part series just on that.
Absolutely.
Right. But like but understanding kind of the general sort of categories of linear versus nonlinear or linear and rotational, you see the same patterns, right? Like it's the same thing, isn't it? Right. To get center of mass over base of support. You know, looking before at the right leg specifically and looking here at the left side specifically, right? So what happens then, you know, when we go and turn this around?
Let's turn it around to
absorbed.
The opposite side. So this is the same gentleman in the first slide. Now he's producing force. Now this is obviously we skipped a couple frames here. So now he's pushing off of his left side. So he had already pushed off his right side, absorbed with his left side, and now he's pushing off of his left side. So we skipped a couple frames, but that's okay. Sure. Now he's going into triple extension on his left side to produce force. Okay, from the center of gravity down toward the ground. And his hip is in extension with a relative external rotation because the T-spine is now rotated toward the open chain side or the swing side. And that shoulder on the left side, that arm is coming up and across midline to create this flexion and relative external rotation relative to where it started from. So that's the shape that we need to see. And again, this is an aggressive, explosive athlete that is showing this, but we see this with everyday movement as well. So let's look back at the medicine ball example. We're only talking about the rear leg.
Left side.
Yep, the left side of the body. Our right side on the screen, her left side. Same kind of action. We loaded the rear leg, and now that has to violently explode. T-spine is rotating toward the wall. The hip is now extending and relatively externally rotated from where we started. And the shoulder is now, that same side shoulder is now driving forward toward the wall, away, opposite what the leg action is doing, which produces that propulsive force. The ball is just at the end of the whip here, and it's going to violently go toward the wall.
And so what's really interesting to me about this is that we have, you know, the absorption and the propulsion, right? We have like the eccentric and the concentric. We have the linear and the nonlinear.
Yes.
And the patterns are the same, right? And I think
are the same.
That at least initially, you know, that makes superficially, that makes a lot of sense to me because, you know, the body is the body, right? Like 99.5% of our DNA is identical to every single person on the planet, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're doing a rotational thing, throwing a discus, a linear thing, sprinting 100 meters, or a really long thing of doing like an ultra marathon, right? Like shoulders are shoulders, torsos are torsos, hips are hips, right? Because the body is the body, right? And so like it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? That there's these general sort of categories of actions that the body has to do in order to cover distance from point A to point B, right? So can you bring up the image again? You know, with the guy and they got it on the left side and you got it on the right side.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, this one. And so we've talked a lot about kinetic linking, haven't we, over the last dozen years or so?
Yeah.
And it's always just been shoulders, torso, hips.
Yes.
Right. But what's really cool about this is that it breaks it down into absorption, propulsion, and with specific actions. Because I'm curious though, right? Like you talked about how good of a cheater the body is, right? How good of a compensator the brain is.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when these then start to fall apart? What happens if we know that people are limited in T-spine rotation? What happens if you're limited in these ranges?
Yeah, so you're going to make up for it somewhere else. So what are our common areas that we see that people have pain? It's shoulder,
shoulders,
low back,
knees.
and knees. I mean, those are typically areas of that end up becoming hypermobile. They're not supposed to be, these super mobile areas, but they end up becoming hypermobile because we're trying to make up for something that doesn't exist in this kind of ideal chain of events. So low back is classic. We tend to typically do a lot of stabilization exercises and add no movement, which the lumbar spine shouldn't have very much movement, but we should have movement at the T-spine. But if you don't have movement at the T-spine, you have to make up for it with excessive motion at your lumbar spine. And we see this time and time again, whether it's because you lack T-spine mobility or you lack hip mobility, your lower back will become a hip or your lower back will try to become a T-spine. And we see this time and time again, because again, in order to not fall over, we have to get center of gravity or base of support. Your body is going to figure out how to do that and how to accomplish that task by moving somewhere else.
So it's going to find a way to make it happen.
It'll find a way to make it happen.
To be carried, you're going to find a way to carry the water, right? Like it is going to be your knee, it's going to be your back, it's going to be your shoulder.
Yep. Absolutely.
That's wild, man. So so we think about this, right? And it's not always the knee's fault.
It's not always the knee's fault.
Your patellar tendon could be taking excess load because your hip can accept force, can absorb force. Right? Can't flex and internally rotate. Is it also that your knee could be taking the load because your T-spine can't rotate to that same side? Like here's his left leg, right? So if it's his left knee that's painful, could it also be that a limited T-spine rotation to his left is gonna be the source of the knee pain, even though it's so far away?
Absolutely. And again, that's a hard concept for most people to kind of see and visually kind of understand. But if that T-spine can't rotate to the left, it could be because the right shoulder can't flex, go forward. It could also be that the left shoulder cannot extend, or it could be a combination of those two, or it could purely be at the T-spine. We need to understand what segment is driving the dysfunction, but we need to understand the directionality, which we have an article on our site about directionality of the T-spine and how that coordinates with motions of the lower quarter. But we need to see that that T-spine has to rotate to the left, and then we need to understand why. Is it because of the shoulders? Is it because of the T-spine? Is it both? And we need to understand, again, how that lives within this kind of lower quarter. And typically knee, again, it's not 100%, but typically knees take on the brunt of force when it's an absorption or eccentric action. And if you don't have that, you have to use your quad. You hear this term quad dominance, and over dominant quads is a symptom of trying to make something that should be rotational. You're trying to make it linear by just getting that quad to do most of that work. And again, the glutes are never shut off completely. I think that's a misnomer, thinking that glutes have amnesia or glutes are shut off or glutes aren't working.
Right.
They're working. They're just not working as hard as the quads are.
Not doing what they should be.
Right. Again, this is what happens in all humans. Honestly, we are unbelievable compensators and cheaters. And again, we have to accomplish tasks because we don't like to fall over. I think you said this in the previous webinar. No one wants to be embarrassed falling on their face.
Well, like, the groceries got to get in. Like you got to pick up your kid when they're crying. Like there's things that just have to be done. Yeah. Right? And I think what's wild about this is, just because you haven't got the movement competency to make that movement in a way which is repeatable over time doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to make that movement, right? Like, it's not like just because I'm limited in hip flexion and internal rotation, I can't go run, right? Like, I can go run.
You can go run.
It's a sort of facade, right? Like this cloak that your brain just plays on you, or pulls over you, right? Like, and so here is interesting because we call it the ankle here, and we talked about shoulders, torso, hips. As a physical therapist, when you look at somebody comes in subjective pain, subjective knee pain with running on the left side when the foot contacts the ground, right? We talked about shoulders, torso, hips. Does this then, go throughout the rest of the body? Maybe like, cervical spine, or thinking, like what's happening at the knee or the ankle or even like the big toe? Like, do these patterns extend beyond what you presented so far?
Absolutely. They will extend. And again, the joints that we typically look at beyond the shoulder, torso, hips is going to be we'll look at the knee and the ankle. So the knee, really below the knee as well. I mean, yes, generally at the knee, we'll look at the tibia and we'll look at the ankle. And then we also look at the cervical spine as well, because those can also be driving some dysfunction as well. Or they could just be the path of least resistance that is also manifesting symptoms because of the shoulder, torso, hips. The ankle can be a site of also driver because we are interacting with the ground. So as that interacts with the ground, again, the ankle could be an issue. But again, we have to understand directionality within that ankle. We can't just do global ankle mobility and hope for the best. We have to figure out how that ankle and tibia lives within the knee, lives within the hip, lives within the T-spine and the shoulders in a specific direction. And we need to pattern those neuromuscularly. So it's not just a mechanical aspect. Once we clear the mechanical issues through those joints, then we have to understand neurally how those sequence and how those work together. And that way the knee can be the knee and it's not the knee's fault. If we try to just bulletproof the knee, that's fine, but we'll never get the T-spine to rotate toward that knee. And the knee will get stronger. No one is saying we don't need strong knees, but the knee itself can't be the issue. We have to work at these things, in context and in concert. So, even from a recovery standpoint, we can do all the magic to the knee and around the knee and the quad, cupping and
compression,
compression and ice,
all that sort of stuff.
All that sort of stuff. We can calm down an angry knee. That's fine. But if we don't start to address some of these other areas, the knee will always be angry and you'll always be doing something where you have to feel like you have to calm down that knee, which defeats the purpose.
So it's almost a short-term, long-term strategy, isn't it? Right? Like we showed earlier at the top of the presentation, when would we prioritize cold tub? When will we prioritize compression? When will we prioritize static versus active stretching? And those are things that you do on the day, right? Because as coach, I know that I need my client, my member, my athlete to feel better when they leave than when they got here, right? But what I love about what you've presented here, Ami, is that this is a sort of a breadcrumb trail for me to chase as a coach through programming to be able to attack soft tissue mobility or stability of the shoulders, the torso, and the hips in a much more deliberate way, and in a way that seems to allow me to move a bit farther to the left on the continuum of rehab to performance, right? And potentially for therapists to move a bit more to the right on that same continuum, right? Like, cause it seems like it gives us opportunity to speak a common language, right? It seems like it gives us opportunity to, to understand kind of the process and how this comes together.
There we go. We skipped a second.
Yeah,
there you go. This is what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
We're all functioning on this continuum. It's not a one. Rehab is over here on the left and performance is over here on the right, and there's a clear delineation. Good training should look like good rehab. Good rehab should look like good training. And we definitely have our strengths on either side of the continuum. But again, they will start to merge and they should look more alike than different. And typically we don't see that, unfortunately. We see that they are two separate worlds that don't merge together, and there's no, and then we think, oh, well, we'll just magically bridge the gap with something else, like a third category that just bridges the gap. It's like all of these things should flow within each other. And then we have the neuroscience and the dietitian and nutrition basically spanning across all of them. They are, like you said, on the margins.
Table stakes, low hanging fruit, right? Like knock that stuff out, because that's just going to set a good foundation.
Absolutely,
man. That's really good. That's really cool. I think because at the center of it, especially like you think about this delineation, right? Like we have this idea that it's a hard border, right? Like if a person gets handed off from a physical therapist, get handed off from rehab, and 100% good to go, fully cleared, right? Like, let's put on a lot of weight. Let's go real fast day one. But it's not that simple, is it? Right? Simple. Like we like to think about the world as a sort of binary of 1 or 0, black or white, yin or yang. But it really, the huge majority of people, the huge majority of things exist in the middle somewhere, right? There's some different shade of gray.
And we often skip the middle, right? So you go get rehab and your knee's good. Right. They're super myopic on the knee, and the knee gets strengthened. We increase the range of motion, and we do these very specific things, which is part of the puzzle, but we miss the middle, zone. And then we think, okay, you're good to go. Here you go, coach. Mm-hmm. Knee's good. But we never figured out how that knee needs to live within the hip, which needs to live within the thorax, which also needs to live within the shoulders and the shoulder girdle complex. Right. So if we don't understand that, we typically see this re-injury. While the knee was fine, we got it to 100%, isometric testing, range of motion testing, manual muscle testing, whatever the testing was.
On hamstring ratios, whatever, yeah.
Right. We got it to a great point, and then we hand them over, and it's like, oh, you must have broke them.
But along that line, like, what do we do about this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do we go and thoughtfully sort of put the pieces together that we're able to sort of attack the source issue as opposed to just chasing symptoms?
So what you're talking about is programming intentionally across position, pattern, power? Funny how that works.
It sounds kind of familiar.
And we've talked about position, pattern, power for years, and again, that's such a nice kind of first principle or heuristic that we talk about. And again, this does come true. Do we have the positional prerequisites to make these said shapes? Do we have the neuromuscular control to understand now how to make these shapes repetitively and sequence and within different timings? And then we add performance on top of that, which we typically say is power, but it's probably more performance. We talk about that of how do we now overlay more strength and power on top of that, or any other performance variable for that matter. So again, we just revisit this quickly. Is it always the knee's fault? And it typically isn't. If it was that simple, and we're a robot and we can just replace the knee, which actually we do replace knees in humans.
We do.
But have we exhausted the fact that there are probably other areas why that knee is mechanically becoming the path of least resistance? It's usually not the knee's fault. So we typically see movement as just, a sum of the parts, a sum of all of the parts. It's not just anything in isolation. We have to understand how the human body works in concert. And a failure and inability of any one of these things can lead to dysfunction further up the chain or down the chain, which is, for this example, is the knee. So is it happening from below? Like the tibia is actually rotated, the foot is abducted, pronated. They have plantar fasciitis, they have tibial, a posterior tib tendon, they have a navicular drop, they have heel spurs, they have plantar fasciitis, they have a hallux valgus, big toe, rigidus. I mean, all of these things can lead to the fact that, the knee becomes the path of least resistance. Yeah. Or it could be happening from above. T-spine does not rotate, or the hip does not flex or rotate well. And again, that brunt of the force has to happen somewhere else. And the knee typically is that kind of middle of the road, and it becomes the issue.
Well, and it's just, it just, again, it is, if you have to move from point A to point B, you have to move from point A to point B.
Yeah. Right? Like, absolutely.
Just because you haven't got the dorsiflexion, just because you haven't got the, the hip flexion or the hip internal rotation, you're still going to find a way to do it.
Yeah, I'll turn my foot out. I'll turn my foot out and I'll push myself forward.
And right now, and today, in this moment, that's okay. Right? But like over time, it's not. Right? Because you accumulate exposure. And then, if you're limited in T-spine rotation, you get the example, then the rotation has to come from somewhere. Right? And so lumbar spine takes it up. Lumbar spine isn't meant to rotate that much. Yeah. And so today, in this moment, picking up your kid or your dog or whatever, that's fine. Yeah. But over time, if you do that again and again and again and again and again, that just accumulates, right? Like into overuse, under recovery, right? Like, and so if we don't resolve that T-spine rotation, then your lumbar spine is never your low back pain is never going to go away, is it?
It's never going to go away. And we can try to bulletproof the lumbar spine. Don't get me wrong. You can put intentional load on the lumbar spine and try to make that stronger, try to make that more resilient. because you're saying,
Yeah.
oh, that tissue failed because it wasn't properly prepared. And again, there are methodologies that look to focus purely on putting us in bad positions and strengthening those. And I'm not saying you can't do that. That's an advanced form of rehab or even strength and conditioning. As long as the other areas are moving and functioning properly, could you start to, try to bulletproof that area? Absolutely. But again, Gray Cook has always said this, in a nice way of don't put performance on dysfunction or don't put fitness on dysfunction is a quote that Gray always likes to say. And we've also adopted that over the years as well. We don't put performance on dysfunction. So if that area is not functioning well, lumbar spine isn't functioning well and it's hypermobile and it's excessively flexing and or rotating or extending and or rotating, we can't just strengthen that pattern hoping for the best and trying to bulletproof it, trying to make it stronger, more resilient. And again, no one is saying those areas don't need to be strong. They do. Don't get me wrong. But you are missing a piece of the puzzle if you only are focusing on that one joint, that one area to make it stronger.
It's like that one joint, that one area, that one quality of strength, of resilience it's like a character, right? Whereas like these patterns of kinetic linking, it's like the stage, right? Like and you can have one without the other, but it's not the show that it would have been.
No.
And so like in position pattern power, we've always talked about like positionally, you have to be able to make the shapes, right? Can you get down to the bottom of your squat? Can you get up to the top of your pull-up? Can you in terms of the motions that your hips, your shoulders, your torso need to be able to make? And then pattern, can you coordinate those? And we've always talked about how like those two things are fundamental to your ability to then put good, high quality training, strength quality based training on top of that. And so here, like mobility, stability, range of motion, right? Like we've got to make sure that you have the range in order to be able to kinetic link with sequencing and weight distribution, right? So that you're able to sort of put the pieces together to make the movements fundamentally,
right?
So that we can then, in a safer, quote unquote, safer or more secure sort of environment, add on these performance-based qualities of strength, total body power, metabolics, going for longer duration, these sorts of things.
Absolutely.
So if we see somebody and we want to focus like a soft tissue, yes. Like a pillar prep session on absorption, yes.
Here's a pillar prep session on absorption. We're going to hit the big rocks, and again, if you have someone that can identify these areas for you, then that's great. But again, as a general pillar prep for an absorption focus, we would need to look at the T-spine. We would need to look at the glutes. It could be glute max. It could be piriformis. We need to look at the adductor group and foam roll the calf, as well as maybe even the hamstring. So we look at the posterior chain to be able to create absorption or make that shape of absorbing down across midline. So this is an area that you can, again, just as a self-assessment, do any of these areas feel okay? Compare the right and left sides. This could be a nice recovery session for your knee. Now, could you still do your quads? Absolutely. But again, you can do whatever you want locally to the knee, but these are the big rocks of shoulder, torso, hips being able to focus into this function, into the shape, and we'll look at some more shoulder stuff in a second, but this is a little bit more lower quarter focus. We could look at the upper quarter. We could look at the pecs and the shoulder girdle and the bicep to be able to make that shape as well. These are the big rocks that need to be true in order to make the shape of absorption.
And this is sort of in that long term, right? Like resolve the source issue. You talked about can you still foam the quads if your knee hurts? Well, of course you can.
Absolutely.
Right? Like because there's got to be again, like person leaves the building, they've got to feel better than when they got here.
They want to feel better.
Right? So if like I want you to feel better, you know, like
we all want to feel better.
If foaming your quad's going to make that happen, then fine. Right? But let's not, I think what you're saying is let's not just foam the quads for knee pain and consider it done. Right? Like, because it's not.
Right. And this gets a nice kind of sequencing, a patterning, a neuromuscular reset. Again, it allows us to focus on other areas. This is a nice way we can either do it as a pillar prep, but it could also be a standalone recovery session. An active recovery session may look like this for this client that has an absorption issue. Shin box with rotation. It could
be complementary exercises.
Exactly. Shin box with rotation down across midline. This is to the right. You look at an adductor stretch with rotation. Again, down and across midline to the right. Stride stretch with hip extension.
And is that in the adductor and with the shin box?
Yeah.
Is he rotating towards his right? Because
He's
the right
rotating
hip is in
toward
that
the
flex position.
the right side. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're putting those pieces together here in the mobility section.
We're putting it in the mobility and stability section because again, it's not just static stretching. We're not just holding it. You can, but again, this is an active component. We're going to sequence our breath as well. Exhaling as we go down and across midline. That exhale will allow us to tap into our parasympathetic system and allow us to kind of calm down and understand that. And again, if we can't breathe in these positions, we truly don't own them.
You don't own them. It's classic Kelly Starrett. Right, like, and could you along that line too? That just rang a bell for me. Down in that, like, so think about the shin box rotation. Think about this adductor strut rotation. You get into that rotated position. Like Kelly talks about doing like a PNF with your breath.
Yeah,
right. Like
absolutely.
You get down into that rotated position. Take a big breath. Squeeze into the breath, and then as you release, it's almost like you get a contract, relax PNF pattern. As you release the breath, find a little bit more range, right? Take advantage of that little bit more range.
Absolutely. Inhale, exhale, go into the initial range. Once you're there, try to see if you can take that full inhale that you could in neutral. And then as you exhale, ride that wave down and see if you can go a little bit further.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But again, most people they hold it for a second or two and then they come out of it. But if you really coordinate your breath, stay there for the inhale. Stay there again for the exhale. Ride that wave down. Come in and out of that. Again, you should be able to comfortably breathe. If you're holding your breath, you're straining yourself to get there, then you don't own that shape. Right. You don't own that position.
You don't.
Now the stride stretch, a figure four type of pigeon type of stretch, that, yes, you're in external rotation of the hip, but we are looking at getting into that flexion shape of the lead leg. And again, we can also pair that with rotating down and across midline to the right. I was going to ask about that. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. I wouldn't be able to do that.
Which allows us to coordinate.
My hips wouldn't let me do that.
Your hips would explode. And then this DNS star pattern. Again, Jair here is on his right-hand side. This is an eccentric control as he goes down and across midline, reaching forward. And then now we can actually start to pattern the opposite pattern. Once we've absorbed, now as he returns and belt buckle forward and coming forward on that down hip, that goes to a hip extended pattern, T-spine rotating away from that bottom leg and gets a little bit of the propulsion pattern, but we're just undulating back and forth. Can he start to coordinate upper body and lower body? And we're just cutting him off at the knees here, so we don't worry about the ankle at this point.
Yeah, but that is as he drops down into that position, in the image right here, his left arm is reaching forward, so it's like he's rotating his T-spine towards his right.
Yes. His
right hip is flexed, and loaded, isn't it? Loaded. As he comes down into that position with his body weight. That's a loaded then environment, and that is the absorption shape.
It's exactly the absorption
of running. He's just lying down. He just forgot
to stand up. This is Nicole loading. The med ball on that right
with
side?
the medicine ball. Yeah,
it's all the same thing.
That's good. So with the soft tissue and then with these mobility pieces leading up to DNS star, that's like working on sort of the pieces, right? Soft tissue mobility, stability.
Absolutely.
But through the lens of absorption for shoulders, torso, hips.
Yeah. And what we've kind of focused on with our athletes is understanding if they're more of an absorption, limitation or a propulsion limitation. Yeah. And this could be a great pillar prep session, but it also could be a nice recovery session, honestly, to make sure these areas are moving properly. They get the awareness, they get the self kind of assessment. They understand what their tissue quality feels like. Their big rocks might change based on, their evaluation or assessment, but these are general things that we basically start to program. And again, this is how we can individualize within a training group, as long as you can identify which shape they have issues. Who needs what?
Oh, and these could even be complementary exercises, couldn't they?
They can be complementary exercises, absolutely.
Anything. Yeah, you could
absolutely.
So what about propulsion?
And I know we're up at the top of the hour, so those of you guys can hang on for a few more minutes. We'll just cover the opposite pattern. And we have the big rocks of again, you can do the T-spine again if you'd like to, which is completely fine. We do the T-spine, we can do the lats. Now we're going to do the anterior chain on the lower quarter. Quads, TFL, specifically lateral quads most people tend to ride pretty hard. These are areas that we can do to now help make the propulsion shape. And again,
Right.
there are a few more things we can do, but these are, again, some general big rocks from a propulsion standpoint, looking at soft tissue. And then again, soft tissue mobility stability, we will follow up with the mobility stability portion. We can do a 90-90 stretch. You can do a kettlebell arm bar. You can do, you can do anything really that rotates that T-spine away. Again, the reference is away from the rear, the bottom leg here.
Sure.
A quadruped rocking with lat stretch, and again, away from the leg that needs to extend. These kind of undulate back and forth, unfortunately. We get the images to where they're all focusing on one side. But quad hip flexor stretch just reach. You can do it as a couch stretch or a rear foot elevated quad hip flexor stretch with that shoulder going in flexion. Yeah. And then, we can have him also rotate his T-spine away from the rear leg or over the front leg as well and coordinate with breath. And then the half get up.
That's good.
Half get up. Now that we lengthen that hip flexor, now we can do a half get up post to bridge. This is just a high bridge. And we can have him bridge the bent leg. Both legs are slightly extended, are going to be extended at the top, but the driver is going to be that bent leg that goes into kind of a single leg bridge, if you will. And again, that T-spine is now rotated also away from the bent leg.
And that's good. That's so good. And it's sort of as expected, right? These are sort of like the opposite, the inverse of the absorption exercise.
Opposite of the inversion. And again, we have to understand, we have to categorize people into one of these two groups. And again, there's going to be very specific right or left designations. They're going to have issues going in one direction or another. And that is the difference. And we don't see a lot of bilateral movements here because, again, we are trying to prime the body for function, for locomotion.
For human movement.
For human movement. All of the same.
Point A to point B. We get squat point A to point B.
We get enamored by strength movements, bilateral strength movements, squatting, bench pressing, deadlifting. We love those things because they draw us in. We feel good doing those things. But again, we have to fundamentally ask ourselves, does that prepare us for the activities of life, of sport,
well,
humans?
And are you ready for it, right? Like, I don't think it's to say that those things don't have a place, right? Like, if you're an athlete that lives in performance land and your job, like your ability to support your family, it rides on, you being fast, then yeah, of course, I think there's a really good argument to be doing some of these heavier bilateral type things. I think what this does, though, for me at least, is it colors in, the position and pattern part of the position, pattern, power pyramid in a really sort of what feels like a complete way. In that we have these patterns of absorption, propulsion. We have these patterns of action, shoulders, torso, hips. We have these really simple programs, and it could just be like a day 1, day 2, right?
Yeah,
day 1.
Absolutely.
We work on absorption. Day 2, we work on propulsion, right? Just cast a wide net. And the thing that's cool about these is that they're deliberate. They build towards a larger common goal or a theme, and they can improve, the ability of somebody to be able to get center of mass over base of support, so that as they cover distance from point A to point B, they're able to do that in a reproducible way that's not going to overload tissues over time.
Right.
I think this is really clever. This is really cool. I really appreciate you coming in here and talking about this and across thinking back across, all 4 parts of this. It gave a general sort of frame up and sort of tee up initially, right? And some very basic recommendations. Neural day, do this. Mechanical day, do this. Metabolic day, do this. Psychological stress, do this. But then what I really like about the content that you and Shannon and Chris have provided is that it's given a much more complete sort of umbrella. Right. So like with Chris, how do you sort of, like Viktor Frankl, psychologist, talked about the space, right? Between stimulus and response, there is a space, right? There's an opportunity to make a choice, right? And so Chris talked about ways that we can open up that space to make a better choice, to respond more appropriately to stress as stress is applied to us from a psychological perspective. Shannon talked about, managing inflammation. Right? Like, what is the role of inflammation in responding to stress, and where does that come from generally? Right? And she talked about the role that the plays in that, and how that is a all systems response, or a singular sort of response to all types of stress.
Yeah.
Right. And so like those were sort of like the foundational things. And I love that we have the performance slide where you had those as sort of like the margins, right, on either side, because that's the low hanging fruit, man. Like, square up your sleep work on some of these psychological things, manage inflammation through nutrition strategies, and you're going to be setting yourself in a position to respond appropriately to stimulus, to stress. But then what you just did here is you gave, while we gave this sort of on the day kind of recommendation, mural, focus on cold tub, mechanical, focus on static stretching, like these sorts of things. This is really, I think, a longer term solution almost, right? To these sorts of things sticking around.
Those other general recommendations are more kind of symptom management. Yeah, we got to manage the symptoms. But again, the longer term is we have to get to the root cause. And if we don't get to the root cause, and if you don't start integrating some of the root cause elements into your recovery sessions and into your recovery days, like you're going to miss something, and you'll always be chasing that symptom. My legs feel blown up, my knee feels blown up, my hamstrings are on fire, my back is hurting, whatever it is, right? Like I felt, and again, you think, oh, well, that's the intended response that I wanted your hamstrings to be blown up because we did, RDLs, or we did,
heavy deadlifts, whatever,
deadlifts, bounding, whatever it is, it's like, oh, okay, sure. But again, we have to ask ourselves, is that truly the intended response? And again, can we start to couple some of these mechanical and neuromuscular components think of those as resets as well, of again, checks and balances, make sure these individual areas are functioning well. If you don't have a therapist on hand that can identify these things, but you don't have to have a therapist on hand to do these things.
Right.
Identify them purely based off of the demands that this person has to be able to do. Can they absorb? Can they propulse? What does that tissue quality feel like? And you can start to deduce a little bit of where some of these dysfunctions are occurring.
Yeah, and it's so good because that is, that is a much more complete sort of way to manage stress, right? To manage stimulus.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on here, Omi, and sharing some of this content, some of this information. Yeah, I think it's been so valuable. I hope you guys at home have found it valuable. We've got this recorded. The recording is going to end up on the site here in the next month or two. And so look out for part 1, part 2, and part 3. If you miss those, you're welcome to go back and watch those as well. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.